So this is one of my favorite cocktail questions to ask. And to all of your listeners, when you encounter somebody who has not been listening to this podcast, who is the oldest president to have 2 grandchildren who are still alive, I would posit that 99 out of 100 responses will name a president in the 20th century. And people will be shocked when the first hint you give them is that they were born during the presidency of George Washington.
We're going to talk about accidental presidents, John Tyler's grandkids, how the Kennedy presidencies and Johnson presidencies may not have happened and not for any electoral reason. And we're going to talk about Lincoln's hair. Why not? Jared Cohen's a really interesting interview that I've had, and I think we share a like for the subject of presidents. A reminder about the extra podcast from My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpoliticspremium.com to sign up for that. And look, just a good way to support the program. You get a little bit extra meta content where I talk about some of the podcasts and constructing them and the like. You can also just straight up donate, and I appreciate that. Other ways you can help. You want to help out, but another way to help, write an iTunes review, tell someone about the program, all of these things. I am currently working on the Arc of Commerce about railroads. Here's our interview with Jared Cohen. I am speaking with Jared Cohen, the author of Accidental Presidents, 8 Men Who Changed America. Jared, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.
There's so much to talk about. It's such an interesting topic, particularly at this time. But I guess I want to start where else can we begin but with John Tyler, first president to really be a president that one could consider an accident. So you have Tyler succeeding to the presidency, and you know it's not as easy as these VP successions are now, was it?
What's interesting about John Tyler is that the precedent that he set in April of 1841 kind of gets lost in the annals of history. Mm-hmm. And had he not set that precedent, when you look back at the events that transpired, it was more likely than not that he would have failed, or if somebody else had been in that situation, it might have been different. History would have been very different. You would have had 7 accidental presidents who probably would have ascended to the presidency as acting presidents. And I think the history of our country would have been quite different. Tyler was remarkably prepared. He didn't like William Henry Harrison very much. So shortly after the inauguration, he skipped town and went back to his home in Virginia. And Harrison, after giving a grueling 1 hour and 45-minute speech that was so tedious that people began walking around in boredom, became quite ill just a few weeks into his presidency, and a close friend of Tyler's had tipped him off. So Tyler, while he acted surprised when the news was delivered to him at his home, he anticipated Harrison's death, and he had an entire trip from his home back to Washington to anticipate what moves he would make.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've had people question the original stories. Oh, Harrison didn't wear his coat, and then he got sick, and then. But, doctors looking at it in modern times, like, well, when does that incubation period then? It must have happened. The actual pneumonia must have happened later. So he had weeks where, Tyler and Harrison was actually receiving some visitors and doing some things in the White House, spending a lot of it in bed. So now we see that there was actually knowing that is instructive to know about that Tyler had some prep time, but it still wasn't easy. And I suppose, what happens if Tyler just becomes an acting president? I guess it's the cabinet that will end up running things.
I think that's a big unknown. In order to answer that question, I suppose you could look at when Garfield sat there lingering for 80 days after being shot, and the cabinet essentially ran the country during that period while Vice President Arthur stood idle. He effectively functioned as an acting president, but he was so concerned about being seen as overzealous when he had so subverted his own administration that he basically took a back seat. Poor John Tyler ascended to the presidency and had to spend his early month as president defending his right to exist as president. There's no question that the powers of the presidency were in fact in his hands. The debate was whether he in fact was president. He spent his entire presidency returning unopened any letter addressed to him as John Tyler acting president or Vice President Tyler acting as president, which was something that people did endlessly to annoy him. The only person who was thrilled about John Tyler ascending to the presidency was Henry Clay, and that was short-lived. Clay thought he had an ally in John Tyler and soon found that John Tyler was even less likely to make Henry Clay a Manchurian puppet master than his predecessor was. And I think the cabinet became very frustrated early on with Tyler because he abandoned Harrison's one man, one vote approach. He abandoned Harrison's single term pledge. He basically opposed much of the Whig agenda, including the national bank, the protective tariff, internal improvements. He seized complete control over patronage, and he relied on an outside kitchen cabinet of a number of states' rightists from Virginia, which was frustrating to the Harrison men who wanted to continue, with business as usual.
He was the original Whig in name only, and I guess they put him on the ticket mostly because he was an opponent to Andrew Jackson and his overreaching, but not because he loved the Whig policies.
So the Whigs threw Tyler on the ticket for a couple reasons. One, back then nobody really wanted to be vice president, and I suppose that hasn't changed much since. But Tyler was really a Democrat. They threw him on the ticket to win Virginia, which they lost, as a nod to states' rightists, which didn't really happen anyway, and because he was available. But also back then, the vice presidency, if somebody wanted it, was seen as kind of an award given to people who'd had honorable service. The framers of the Constitution only included the vice president position as an electoral mechanism. They wanted it to be a proper understudy, sort of next in line position. And by the time Tyler died, none of the framers of the Constitution were alive. The last living link to the framers was really Dolly Madison. So you didn't have any of those firsthand accounts.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, you don't see the vice president in that role at all. Not through much of the 19th century, but you certainly don't see John Adams kind of watching or being included in every decision Washington was making. Is much more likely to go to, say, Hamilton on a few issues, write a letter to Jefferson, get his take. But Adams is just waiting there. It's an interesting thing that they go through. And it's interesting what you say about the cabinet, or Clay, really, who I believe is in the Senate at this point, wanting to seeing an opportunity to have possible, easy person to play, because it seems to happen again and again. And each time they're wrong. They do it with Chester Arthur, right? They do it with Andrew Johnson, and it's each time they're wrong.
Yeah. And this is the interesting thing to me about writing this book is how, despite the fact that it happened 8 times and despite the 19 times that it almost happened throughout our history, we seem to have completely started from scratch and developed no institutional memory for why the second in command matters. But I also, since you mentioned John Adams, I wanted to go, one of my favorite quotes comes from John Adams as vice president when he said, and I quote, "My office renders me so completely insignificant that all parties can afford to treat me with the decent respect which accordingly they do, as far as I observe or hear or suspect. They all know that I can do them neither much good nor much harm." Yes. And I think that very much summarizes the essence of what our nation's first vice president thought of the position. And then, of course, there's John Nance Garner, who said it's not worth a bucket of piss. But in the case of John Tyler and Henry Clay and John Tyler's ascension, there should have been no earlier evidence that the vice president needs to be somebody who's ready to lead and one can imagine being president than when he ascended to the presidency after just 30 days of Harrison as chief magistrate. And Henry Clay got a pretty rude awakening early on, which culminated in the first vetoing of the National Bank. And the first time that Tyler vetoes the National Bank, it results in, literally a almost stampede of the White House by angry Whig supporters who were egged on by Henry Clay. They burn Tyler in effigy. They throw things through the window of the White House. Apparently, it terrified the Tyler women in the House. And a fun, not so well known fact is we have a metropolitan night police in Washington, D.C. in direct response to angry, drunken Whigs antagonizing the Tyler family after he vetoed the first national bank bill.
Right. We could thank the Whigs, the Whigs for that. That's the lasting, the one thing they did that lasted, not the party. But
yes, no, I think they would have had police at night at some point.
And Tyler, struggles with the presidency. He gets in right at the last minute with annexing Texas, but I think doesn't seem to get credit for much. He has 2 grandsons still living. You heard about that, right? I mean, 2 still living.
So this is one of my favorite cocktail questions to ask, and to all of your listeners, when you encounter somebody who has not been listening to this podcast and who is not one of the handful of people in the world who's an expert on John Tyler, ask them the question: who is the oldest president to have 2 grandchildren who are still alive? I would posit that 99 out of 100 responses will name a president in the 20th century, and people will be shocked when the first hint you give them is that they were born during the presidency of George Washington. And Tyler had 15 children. One died at more or less at childbirth. He had 8 children with his first wife, 7 with his second. His eldest child he had in his 70s, and that child fathered 2 children in his 70s, and those 2 children are still alive and in their late 80s and 90s. It is literally one of the most fascinating stories of presidential longevity. And it's interesting, if you look at videos of Lyon Tyler and Harrison Tyler, the two grandsons, because they're grandsons and not sort of distant descendants, they actually look like John Tyler. So you get a nice sense of what Tyler, who himself lived to be pretty old, would have looked like. Now, you mentioned Texas. I think that the story of Texas is very interesting because John Tyler begins a pattern that we see with all of our accidental presidents, which is they become consumed with this idea that they want to become president in their own right. And Tyler understood this better than anybody because he was referred to as his accidency and an accident and an imposter throughout his entire presidency. He had been excommunicated from the Whig Party formally and became a president without a party after he vetoed the second bank bill. And so getting the nomination as the front of the Whig ticket in 1844 wasn't possible. The Democrats liked him, but they were still bitter at him for having run as a Whig in the 1840 campaign. And so Tyler determined that his best path to being elected in his own right was to do something dramatic, which is champion the annexation of Texas, which was a highly contentious and difficult issue for both parties, and peel away pro-Texas enthusiasts from both the Whig Party and the Democratic Party, split the vote enough that it could get tossed to the House of Representatives, and he could cobble together winning election in his own right. This is also interesting because John Tyler launches the first really active covert war of any president in history as a way to kind of intrigue to annex Texas. So Texas really, his desire to annex Texas really is a combination of a response to being kicked out of the Whig Party and an obsession with winning the presidency in his own right.
Yeah, it's interesting. And a reminder, we're talking with Jared Cohen, who's the author of Accidental Presidents, 8 Men Who Changed America, from Simon & Schuster. And, we're talking about people who got to the presidency by accident. I don't think you can escape. I'm sure in many interviews you've done, you can't escape the what's going on in today's politics. And today is that we have a president who I don't know if it's fair to say he considers himself an accidental president. I think he hinted at it. Certainly members of his staff think that it was such a surprise that he won. We have Michael Cohen, his lawyer, recently testifying to the House that they had no idea the Trump campaign they were going to win. It was mostly to just kind of get the name out, maybe get some issues out. And maybe run a better campaign than other GOP candidates would have to really go after the Democrats in a way the others wouldn't have been able to, they felt, but not that they would win. So you have a president that's accidental, and no one, very few people expect it. that he would be there. Anything about your book and doing this book, it gives you perspective on a kind of a figure that's unexpected coming into the presidency?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call President Trump an accidental president. I would call him kind of the ultimate unexpected and dark horse candidate who became president. But what it shows us is that despite the fact that we've thought about, we've gone from not having clarity on whether the vice president becomes the president and having no provision to replace the vice president when it's left vacant, to a situation where every minute is accounted for. A president can't go in for a colonoscopy without signing over the powers to the vice presidency with the 25th Amendment. We have a designated survivor. We have all sorts of things accounted for. And yet we still haven't figured it all out because we haven't thought about what happens in a scenario, if a president is compromised and isn't impeached or removed from office, isn't willing to resign. I don't think the disability clause would be triggered for that. So it's whether I say that all speculatively because we obviously don't know the facts, but it's a reminder that we still haven't thought of everything. Right. I think the story of our 8 accidental presidents ends up serving as a really interesting case study to view the Constitution as a living document. And if you think about how much we've navigated throughout history without having very much defined, I would argue that if we had tremendous specificity around succession at the earliest stages of the Republic, we may not have navigated this so well. And you see this with the kind of whiplash and experimentation with how to do succession throughout history, right? They start by having, the president pro tempore, followed by the speaker, and then they get rid of both of them and replace the succession with cabinet. And then Harry Truman in 1947 switches the order and puts the speaker of the House, then the president pro tem, and then the cabinet. And we have the 25th Amendment. In the middle there, we have the 20th Amendment, which says if the president-elect is assassinated or dies, the vice president-elect becomes president. So we sort of experimented throughout history. I think what's interesting about this current moment is how little conversation there is about the vice president. For all the conversations about, is there going to be impeachment? Is there not going to be impeachment? Are we in a constitutional crisis? Are we not in a constitutional crisis? I hear very few people talking about a scenario where you have a President Pence. Now, I'm not passing judgment one way or the other. I'm just arguing that seems noticeably absent from the conversation. And I think the reason for this is despite all of our experiences with succession and accidents and so forth, we still only choose vice presidents to win a state, appease a constituency, or balance a ticket. And it is ahistoric to argue that the selection of a vice president accomplishes any of those things. I have concluded that the only thing a candidate should factor in when thinking about a vice presidential choice is, can they be can you imagine them as president? Are they going to overshadow you on the campaign trail? Mm-hmm. And or are they going to embarrass you? So where that nets out is if you're at the front of a ticket, you want to choose somebody who everybody can imagine being president and who's sufficiently boring and capable.
Well, I think and those are great. I think it's tough because in each election, it's usually different decisions that factor in. Pence is probably coming out of, well, Trump wasn't from the establishment. Pence had been in the House, governor of a state, gave him some credibility within the kind of standard GOP party. And almost every VP choice, and maybe a few exceptions. I'm thinking about Clinton and Gore, and Clinton picks another young senator, and maybe didn't have to. That wasn't to appease the liberal wing of the party by picking another moderate Southerner. It was to double down and maybe a little bit of that, like, hey, this guy could be president. And I think Bill Clinton always felt that. But most choices, I think, are through history are just these like kind of for some party, either intra-party reason when they got those problems, or for a general election reason. Oh, I really need to win this state. I mean, the number of, there's a road in Indiana, Vice President's Road. It's not really named that, but they give it that, they give the area, because there's so many vice presidents just mostly picked to win the state of Indiana. Pence joins them, although I don't think they needed those electoral votes. I think that to flesh out the point a bit, I think that's great. What you said about in terms of today's politics, if to do it in a wholly kind of bipartisan fashion here, because I have listeners of all sorts of stripes. On one hand, I think that this book is interesting and these issues are interesting because, yes, if you're totally on one side of things, Trump could potentially be compromised and he might be impeached soon. And there's that issue. On the other side, if you're a Trump supporter, the issue that I get a lot, or the way the issue is presented to me a lot, is like, look, this guy gave up his business. He didn't want to be president. He did this for the country. He's in effect like an accidental president. And the media is being so rough on him. The establishment wants him out of there. And you can stretch that from a little light treatment of the media as being unfair to some people who believe entirely in like a deep state apparatus against the president. I believe from your book, my takeaway is look at all the different types of people who did become president. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's some people that are thinking this Trump, it's crazy. This guy, how could this guy be, the office is going to be destroyed. Let's say there might be some people thinking that way, but you look at the history and look at these people. Of the 8 people, I mean, do you think any one of them would have been elected?
So the only one of the 8 accidental presidents that would likely have become president eventually in his own right was Teddy Roosevelt. Lyndon Johnson was certainly had the qualifications to do it, and maybe had he gotten into the race earlier in 1960, he wouldn't have created space for the Kennedy charisma to take over. Mm-hmm. But I think you can really only look at Teddy Roosevelt and say this man, regardless of whether he inherited the presidency, would have eventually run and won in his own right. But I think you're right about President Trump. We have never had somebody with his particular background as president. And the combination of his background with the current social media environment that exists, is a sort of perfect storm that we've never seen before. So in that sense, we really are in an unprecedented situation. What's interesting, and here's where I want to distinguish between a dark horse candidate, which Trump is, and an accidental candidate, which he wasn't. Because he made a deliberate decision to run. He probably just didn't think he was going to win. There has actually been one accidental president in history who didn't inherit the presidency, and that's James Garfield, ironically. Garfield went to the 1880 Republican convention with the intention of nominating Governor Sherman, who had no chance of winning the nomination to become president. It was really between, it was the era of half-breeds and stalwarts. One wanted, Grant to come in for a non-consecutive third term. The other faction wanted James Blaine, and it was going to be one or the other. So Garfield gets up on stage to nominate Governor Sherman, again, who has no chance. And somebody screams from the audience, "We want Garfield." And the convention is deadlocked. It goes into 30 plus ballots, and Garfield does everything he can to not get the nomination. He doesn't want it. A couple ballots later, Garfield finds that he's been nominated to be the Republican candidate for president, and his face goes pale, his eyes open. He's, completely shocked by the moment. He tries to counter it, tries to push back, says, can a convention nominate somebody who doesn't seek the nomination? And he obviously went on to become president and was assassinated 3 months after taking the oath of office. So Garfield was the only truly accidental president, in the sense that he's the only man ever to become president without seeking his party's nomination and without inheriting the presidency. Yeah,
and he's succeeded by Chester Arthur. The huge surprise there is one where if we were to go back in 1881, and anyone who would study the politics of that period, they would be just as shocked, I believe, as the same what happened when Ronald Reagan became president and he had been a movie actor, or when Donald Trump became president and here's a guy who had run casinos and been reality TV. Or I'm supposed in 1960, some people were shocked that kid who was Kennedy's son, got elected in a squeaker and beat the vice president. I mean, the shock that when Chester Arthur succeeded and actually was to become president was huge. But he turns around. I mean, it's a story in history, at least, is that he does great things in office.
Chester Arthur makes the most remarkable transition of any accidental president in history, in the sense that Chester Arthur was the opposite of James Garfield. James Garfield was probably the most beloved man ever elected to the presidency. Came from simple beginnings, last president born in a log cabin, hid runaway slaves as a kid, Civil War general and a legitimate hero. I mean, a truly inspiring story, even among his adversaries, but also totally unshackled from party politics. He ends up, having Arthur thrown on the ticket with him as a nod to, New York party boss Roscoe Conkling and, the Ulysses S. Grant bloc. Otherwise, they threaten to split the ticket. And Arthur is, Mr. Machine politics, was fired from his job as collector of the New York Customs House for corruption, was a man so vain that he changed his birthday to appear younger. Obsessed over his outfits and money, and as vice president spent his entire time trying to subvert his own president's administration, caring more about patronage and machine politics than the success of an administration that he was part of. And his subversion of President Garfield was so widely known as vice president that when Garfield is assassinated, and it didn't help that he was assassinated by an office seeker and Arthur was Mr. Spoils, but that office seeker named Garfield as the beneficiary of the president's death. Garfield essentially had to go into quasi hiding for several months because people thought that he was responsible for Garfield's assassination. But something happens to him when Garfield is shot. He has this emotional breakdown and reversal where he blames himself. And a psychologist might say that it reminded him of not being there for his wife when she lay on her deathbed because he was off electioneering, or maybe he truly blamed himself. But he has this remarkable turnaround. And a big part of the turnaround with Arthur is an invalid woman who lived on the Upper East Side in New York began writing him these long-form letters. Her name was Julia Sand, and she wrote him 30-plus letters. She was the 1881 equivalent of an internet troll, if you read these,
right.
You read these letters. And she tells him he's a terrible man, but he can be better. He's so bad, but he can be better. And we know that these letters had an impact because he showed up at her house one day in his carriage and spent an hour with her. So we know that he read these letters and he digested them. But, Mr. Spoils, Mr. Machine Politics ends up being the president who signs the Pendleton Act, essentially ridding the country of the spoils system and abolishing the modern day civil service. He modernizes the U.S. Navy in a way that hadn't been done, since the War of 1812, and prepares the U.S. for war against Spain a decade and a half later. So he ends up, taking small baby steps to advance civil rights around appointments and some symbolic gestures. So Arthur doesn't become a great president, but he becomes a respected president. But that respected president status is, I think, elevated by just the sheer magnitude of his transformation.
Well, that's interesting. And I think that, there's a Mark Twain comment where he was a staunch Democrat, at least at that time, and he says that he couldn't think of one bad thing to say about how Chester Arthur handled everything. He improves the civil service. He builds up the Navy. I almost say that his inner rebellion began by accepting the vice presidency at all, the nomination even. Roscoe Conkling originally didn't want him to take it when the Garfield folks, extended the hand to him. So just by doing that, he sort of angered Conkling. But then, that wasn't that got patched up, and then so his transformation is an interesting story. I guess one might take from that there is a power to the presidency itself, that it can change individuals, and that once that it's such an ultimate power that this idea of like a Clay or some of the Republicans around Lincoln's time in Congress or in the cabinet, this idea that, oh, this new person's coming to the office, they're going to be so easy to control. But it's not an office that's easily controlled. There's great executive day-to-day power. There's appointments, influence on Congress. And it just seems like, let's say there's some situation and Pence becomes president, which, could range from one day, to take a Trump-friendly view of it. Trump could say one day, you know what, I'm actually more interested in going back to my business right now. I did everything I have to do. Pence, you take over. Or it could be some kind of impeachment or other 25th or something like that. If Pence were to take over, I imagine there's a lot of people maybe in the GOP that say, okay, we're back in charge, the kind of anti-Trump GOP people, or just the congressional people who might have a slightly different agenda, or Mitch McConnell or someone. Or there might be Democrats thinking, okay, we got this guy. I think your book, would show that probably the last thing that the opposing party wants is like a Pence presidency. There should be some reservoir of goodwill based on the Arthur and Coolidge, Johnson, Roosevelt, that the new president is someone that the powers devolved upon. They weren't greedy. They weren't on the top of the ballot. They didn't usually run the whole kind of campaign that the other person did. So two things: not as easy to control as you think, and also probably a little more popular, at least initially, with the American people.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that my book, The Accidental Presidents, shows me is there's a long history of interest groups, factions of parties making certain assumptions about the president being an ally of theirs or the accidental president being an ally of theirs that proves untrue. Whether it's, John Tyler ascending to the presidency and Henry Clay thinking he won the lottery, or Zachary Taylor being elected president in 1848 and all the Southern slave owners assuming that they've got the perfect man as president, only to be surprised that he wants to immediately admit California, Utah, and New Mexico into the Union as free states. Whether it's Andrew Johnson ascending to the presidency and the radical Republicans thinking that they have their best ally, only to find that he becomes a stronger ally of the Confederacy that he once lambasted. Whether it's Arthur surprising the proponents of the spoil system. I think everybody expected Teddy Roosevelt to be exactly who Teddy Roosevelt was. And I think, with FDR, you got what you expected. I think Lyndon Johnson reminds us that presidents can't be controlled, but presidents can be manipulated. And it's very clear to me that had Lyndon Johnson exhibited the same amount of courage on Vietnam that he exhibited on civil rights, had he demonstrated a level of confidence in approaching Vietnam as thoughtfully as he approached civil rights, he would have concluded very quickly that he should have cleaned out his national security cabinet.
Yeah. There's an example of someone, I suppose, Kennedy was a little more thoughtful on the issue. I know he had visited Vietnam in the past, and had his opinions on that conflict. Whereas, Lyndon Johnson coming into the presidency, I think, first of all, is a person that, as great a president he was on one thing's a great, mover and shaker of Congress and influencer of Congress. Got that domestic side down. Somebody that probably never would have been elected. I mean, he could have been, had there not been the Kennedy campaign, it's possibly could have been the 1960 candidate, but I see a pretty much lopsided, election for Nixon in that one. Maybe Johnson pulls Texas in, but loses a lot of northern states that, Kennedy was able to bring in. I think that you have a person that's skilled but doesn't have certain other judgments, and because he hadn't won election in his own right and needed to do so, you see in some of these early steps that he's taking towards Vietnam the absolute need to not lose the conservative vote, particularly the Southern senators, to not be seen as weak on defense, and to not get Eisenhower criticizing him. So he comes from without that election of his own, initially at least, he comes at a different value set. Makes a series of issues that probably a 2-term Kennedy administration, I'd like to think anyway, would have been different.
Yeah. The other thing with Lyndon Johnson is, after writing Accidental Presidents, I feel quite confident in arguing that Johnson was almost certainly going to be dropped from the ticket in 1964. Not because Robert Kennedy hated him, which he did, not because he was in utter pain, which he was, but the Bobby Baker scandal, who Bobby Baker was one of Johnson's main aides, was basically breaking, the week after Kennedy was assassinated, and CBS and Time Warner had the goods on him. And I absolutely believe they were ready to go public, and they pulled it back because of the assassination. It was such a head-snapping transition captured on video that I believe that the media at the time made the deliberate decision that the country could not handle a situation where the president had just been assassinated. His assassin had just been assassinated. They didn't know to what extent there was a conspiracy. And then all of a sudden you have a vacancy. All of a sudden you then have the president having to resign shortly after ascending. And remember, you don't have a 25th Amendment, so there is no provision for replacing the vice president of the United States at that time. In many respects, I believe Kennedy's assassination, was tantamount to LBJ getting the equivalent of a pardon because the media didn't go forward with this story. The other interesting thing about Kennedy that people don't realize is Kennedy was nearly killed by a suicide bomber as president-elect. And when I say nearly killed, I mean, Richard Pavlik, who somewhat stereotypically was a disgruntled postal worker, filled his Buick with enough dynamite to blow up the entire street, according to one Secret Service agent, and would have done it as Kennedy was on his way to church, and didn't do it because he saw Jackie and felt bad. So he followed him to church, moved the dynamite into his pants, was standing 5 feet away from him with his finger on the trigger, and didn't push it because there were too many children around. There's also
that's shocking. Yeah, I hadn't been aware of that story. That's incredible. So you almost had Johnson, early on.
Well, and remember, you have the 20th Amendment, which says that if the president-elect is left vacant, then the vice president becomes president. But it gets complicated because it depends where in the sequence, because they're not president-elect until two things happen. One, the electors cast their votes, and two, a joint session of Congress tabulates those votes. And assassination would have happened before that. So technically, had Pavlik succeeded in killing President-elect Kennedy, the party bosses could have gone in a different direction if they didn't want Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah, that's interesting. That would have been a real. Yeah, I hadn't been aware of that suicide bomber. So that's a real interesting thing to think about. Well, Jared Cohen, you were a very busy person. You're also involved with the Council on Foreign Relations. You've authored a bunch of other books.
I will say that this book, Accidental Presidents, is the book that I have always wanted to write. My parents bought me a book when I was 8 years old called The Buck Stops Here, thinking it was a cute book about presidents. And what they didn't realize is they would then have to have 8 conversations about death with me. They didn't anticipate that an 8-year-old would sort of latch on to 4 assassinations and 4 presidential deaths, not to mention other dark chapters in history, like Richard Nixon. And so I've sort of become obsessed with presidents who died in office since I was a young kid. And, I collect signed documents and presidential items associated with those transitions, including, very strangely, presidential locks of hair. So I have a lock of Abraham Lincoln's hair from the night of his assassination.
Wow.
And I have a lock of William Henry Harrison's hair from when his body lay in rest in the East Room.
How does one get a lock of Abraham Lincoln's hair? I mean, is this eBay or?
No. It's a small market of hair people.
Okay.
And one of the most and I have a hair guy. His name is John Resnikoff. He's the largest collector of historic hair in the entire world. He's also a leading authenticator, and John possesses the most famous lock of presidential hair in the world, which is a very large and thick lock of Lincoln's hair from the exact part of his head where the bullet went through. And I know my 6 strands, which constitutes my lock, comes from that larger one because I sat there over his shoulder taking a video of him pulling the precise 6 strands of hair that I selected as part of this larger one.
Wow. They can get it down to the strand. Yeah, that's yeah, I mean, it's not so, the whole locks of hair thing. I mean, I think my mother in her yearbook and her various books with her high school graduation, 1960 or so, was locks of hair were there. So we're not too far away from that whole thing being quite normal and part of everyday life. Yeah, I mean, the one jumping back a bit, because we talked about Tyler, and Tyler's precedent cemented the vice president, not only the powers devolving on them, but also that they become president themselves. I think that, when you get to 1850, and that helps out Millard Fillmore, who becomes he's not a vice president that's talked about a lot, but he plays a crucial role in the Compromise of 1850. And, you could just imagine, had Tyler not done what he did and not established that precedent in the middle of a debate like that, where the country's being pulled apart and you have Davis and Calhoun and, threatening to leave the Union over California, and Northerners, adamant as well. And that you need that compromise. If you hadn't had a person firmly established, this is now president unquestionably, the whole thing might have turned out differently.
Yes, and I believe 1850 is one of the most interesting years in American history. One, the transition. So when the transition of Zachary Taylor to Millard Fillmore, I believe out of all the accidental president transitions, marks the clearest 180 pivot from the predecessor, in the sense that Fillmore ascends to the presidency and completely unblocks the Compromise of 1850, which Zachary Taylor was standing on his own preventing from happening. What's interesting about Taylor is Jefferson Davis was his closest confidant, and the two of them actually hated each other for a long time because Jefferson Davis married Zachary Taylor's daughter, and at one point Taylor challenged him to a duel, which he didn't accept. When Taylor's daughter dies about 6 months after she and Jefferson Davis get married, Taylor and Davis develop a real affinity for each other, and he really becomes the only person who enjoys the president's confidence. What's also interesting about Fillmore's ascension to the presidency is he makes probably the dumbest move of any accidental president, which is on day one, he fires the entire cabinet. He then asks them if they'll stay on for 3 weeks to help with the transition, and essentially just to be obnoxious and, for lack of a more sophisticated way of putting it, to be jerks about it, they tell him they'll stay on for a little less than a week. So Fillmore ends up with no department chiefs for several months at arguably the most polarized moment in American history. And when I say the most polarized moment in American history, you literally had a moment as Congress was debating what Henry Clay described as the 5 gaping wounds, where a senator pulled a gun on another senator and tried to shoot him right there on the Senate floor. Senator Foote of Mississippi tried to shoot Senator Thomas Hart Benton. And what's remarkable is he literally pulled the gun, had to be restrained. You then had a massive brawl right there in the Senate chamber. And then the gavel was banged and everybody kind of sat down, apologized, and got on with it. Yeah. So I remind people of this story when they think we're in this sort of hyper-polarized moment, which we are, but nobody's pulling a gun on another senator in the Senate chamber.
Yeah, there's no. The one thing I've been dealing with for doing this show many years is the question of, are we in a more partisan time? They asked it back when Bush was president, they asked it when Obama was president. Same question comes up now. We're in this more partisan time. Pointing to these various melees in Congress or duels that are, is really a way of disputing that. You're hearing some great stories. We're talking with Jared Cohen, the author of Accidental Presidents, 8 Men Who Changed America. In addition to writing this book, you're a very busy person. You're involved with, you're a business person. You're involved with, you've written other books. You're involved with the Council of Foreign Relations. Anything you'd like to talk about that kind of led you to writing this book?
There's 3 things that I love. I love history, I love politics, and I love trying to understand lessons in leadership. And I wanted to find a way to combine all 3 of them. I'm also I'm an executive at a tech company, right? And I think that my industry is one of the industries that is focused most on what happens next and moving fast, that we often forget to think about history. But I was a dual major in history and political science at Stanford and ended up as an executive at a tech company. And so I'm a big believer in the fact that my training as an amateur historian and amateur political scientist prepared me to be a business leader. And so I worry that the humanities is a bit under threat in an era where everybody wants to be a computer scientist. And I'm not admonishing the sciences or computer science, but I really believe that we can't understand where we're going and where we are today if we don't reflect back on how we arrived at our current moment. And I think that we draw these sort of sweeping generalizations about what's happening in our country today. And a lot of those generalizations are ahistorical. For instance, if you think about polarization right now, the history of pure partisan polarization is extremely recent. Historically, our country's polarization has been much more driven by sectional differences. Northern Democrats and Northern Whigs and later Republicans, Southern Democrats and Southern Republicans, factions within each party, polarization around how to think about, the disbursement of patronage. It wasn't until Lyndon Johnson signed 3 landmark pieces of legislation that we began a transition away from sectional polarization towards this sort of brief moment where the common enemy of the Cold War made the differences between the parties seem kind of minute. And then it's the end of the Cold War and the ascension of Bill Clinton, which is really the beginning of the pure partisan politics that we know today.
Yeah, I think so. I always, talk about you had somebody like Javits in New York, or you had Yarborough in Texas. I mean, you had liberals in Texas and fairly moderate to liberal in Republicans in New York, and so this doesn't exist in the same way anymore. There's a need to see that change in polarization. Although I always tell people, I mean, you're gonna. For those that wish for a more bipartisan future, just be aware that means in California you need a GOP member, and that means in South Carolina you're going to end up with a Democrat. You may or may not like it. So that's what was needed. For that. Who do you think handled this accidental situation that they were in best, or do you even have a single person?
I mean, I think Harry Truman is the obvious one. I think that Truman was a provincial politician from Missouri who spent just north of 80 days as vice president, didn't get a single intelligence brief, wasn't read into Yalta, wasn't read into the Manhattan Project, had only met with FDR a few times, had basically not thought at all about being president. On top of that, he had impossible shoes to fill and an impossible amount of institutional knowledge to absorb, and he'd never even stepped foot in the map room. And yet, despite that, he brings the war in Europe to a close, brings the war in Japan to a close, making one of the toughest decisions in U.S. history, navigates the post-war order in a way that Woodrow Wilson wasn't able to do at the end of World War I, develops his own opinion about Stalin as opposed to just inheriting and copying FDR's sentiments, recognizing that the situation was fluid and evolving, and ends up being quite a miracle. He ends up having one of the most remarkable and surprising presidencies in history.
Yeah, and he makes a point not to fire his whole cabinet like Fillmore did. And some of the more successful, I look at Roosevelt is a great example, too, of, well, don't fire your cabinet like Fillmore or do anything crazy like that. Make a statement that you're going to keep the policies of McKinley, but slowly but surely make your own imprint on the office.
Yeah. There's one quote I want to share because I interviewed the late President Bush for this book a few times. And I asked him about Harry Truman, because he was deployed. He was deployed in the war at the time, and he told me, and I quote, "It turned out Truman did a fine job, thank heavens. We all assumed we were training for the invasion of Japan. I always felt Harry saved our lives by dropping atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki."
Yeah, there's a guy that, an accidental president with no information that made a great call. Yeah, deserves the credit he gets in history for that. That is that's a great thing to know, that in your book you got to interview the late President Bush.
Yeah, the book has a number of interviews that readers might find useful. I have multiple interviews with the late President Bush. I have multiple interviews with Henry Kissinger, which are fascinating. He has some very interesting views on the vice presidency. I asked him about why FDR didn't more responsibly bring Truman up to speed, and he said that until recently, the president of the United States didn't want the person who would most benefit from their death to be lingering around them too often. I also had a very lengthy interview with former Vice President Cheney. I had interviews with Tom Brokaw about the Kennedy assassination, Paul McCartney about the Kennedy assassination, because Beatlemania happened right after Kennedy was assassinated, and he has a very interesting theory, which I don't write about in the book, that the Beatles were kind of the picked up on a lot of the momentum and demand for Camelot that was kind of left out there following Kennedy's assassination. I also interview H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor, who himself is an expert on Vietnam. So it's the book. It's hard. You can't really do interviews going back to John Tyler and Andrew Johnson, but you can do some really good interviews related to the FDR and Truman chapter and Kennedy and Johnson chapter. I interviewed Condoleezza Rice as well. So the book has some interesting contemporary interviews.
Wow, yeah, it's a wealth of knowledge. Recommend reading it. Accidental Presidents: 8 Men Who Changed America by Jared Cohen, who joined us. Jared, thanks so much for coming on. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. I enjoyed this a lot.
Thank you very much. I did as well.